Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ellie Breakwell, the APM Branches Coordinator. Thank you for joining us today at this APM Thames Valley Branch webinar. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and you're in listen-only mode. There will be some interactive elements to today's webinar, so please have your phone or another browser open ready to go and go to menti.com and use the code 74676204. This will also be displayed on the screen with each question. Today we're joined by Richard Patterson. Richard is an NEC 4 drafter and procurement and NEC specialist at Mott MacDonald. Thank you again for joining us today, and without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellie. So, NEC Framework Contract, a radical concept. I've done an awful lot of NEC training. I've given training on the Framework Contract a few times, but I'm actually thinking this might be the first ever public presentation on the Framework Contract. I've just dumped into these slides, which you'll get at the end of the session, links to the various other sessions that we've already done over the past year and a half on various different aspects of NEC and different contracts in NEC. So hopefully that'll be useful as a sort of one together document to find all that stuff. That's me, Richard Patterson. I managed to get fellowship of the ICE based on my NEC work, which I was really proud of a couple of years ago. I've been with Mott MacDonald since I was in short trousers, and I've been working on the NEC for a good few years. I was lucky enough to be part of the team that put together the changes from 3 to 4, and most recently I've been involved with NEC in the team that developed the new NEC X29 climate change option. That's another one that maybe we should be talking about later. We'll see. Housekeeping's pretty irrelevant because you're all probably at home anyway. If the fire alarm does go, please do leave the building. Right, Framework Contract was released way back in 2005 when NEC 3 first came out, or I should say when NEC 3 came out. It was tweaked a little bit, like everything else in NEC 4, and it's one of very few standard forms out there on the market for a framework. Now, we at Mott MacDonald have got experience of working under these contracts, and also we've got some experience of helping clients put these contracts together. There's a nice article actually in this month's NEC newsletter about the work that we did up on the Clyde to help Defence Infrastructure Organisation put together some fairly major frameworks. So this is all very real. First, why would a client ever want this thing called a framework contract? What is a framework contract fundamentally? Well, firstly, the term, the framework agreement, would you believe it came from the EU procurement regulations? That was way back in the day. Fundamentally, the reason for having it is because it takes away the need for a client to go out to open tender. It basically allows a client to gather together suppliers that might be appropriate, or hopefully will be appropriate, to do chunks of work that at this stage the client hasn't actually sorted out quite what they want. So, too many words on the slide, sorry, but allows you to invite effectively mini tenders from any number of suppliers, and I use that word intentionally because that's a word used by the framework contract. We have a number of suppliers. So if we've got 5 suppliers on a framework contract for jobs between £1 and £10 million for Yorkshire Water, then those 5 suppliers each are signed up to the same framework contract with the client, but then they can carry out instructed work under separate contracts under the framework. You've probably heard this term, under the framework. Client can have one or a number of framework suppliers. They can invite them to bid, and or they might simply negotiate and award the contracts directly. They can set, this is the framework, and it is massively flexible, just like any other thing in the NEC. The other reason that we cite for framework agreements is relationships. We all know that contracts need decent relationships. We need to work together, the whole buzzword of collaborative working. The benefit of a framework, if we're working together with the same organisation over a period of years, we get to know each other. We get to know each other's processes. And to be honest, the reason I guess I've got involved in them, because I work in MacDonald's water team, and in the water sector, like other regulated sectors, they have routine asset management periods. And the standard way that they work is that for each of those 5-year periods, they set up frameworks to do their construction and other contracts. So in the public sector, there's actually a definition. There we go. Look, I've given you the quote. Public contract I don't read the public contract regulations as often as I should do, but that's what they say for a framework agreement. And I'm not going to read it out because you guys have already read it. You get the gist. There we go. The other thing that they say in the public contract regulations is that generally they shall not exceed 4 years. And that's an interesting point because many organisations are finding that 4 years isn't really long enough to establish the long-term relationships that we're trying to make happen in framework. So in some sectors, if it's not breaching any regulations, then some clients have actually put together longer frameworks than 4 years. Couple of links to guidance notes there for you as takeaways for the links about in the how frameworks are supposed to be working in the public sector. And very recently, David Mosey, who's a seriously well-known and well-respected character in the procurement world at King's College in London, put together a very, very thorough review of public sector construction frameworks. And there's a link to it from this slide. It's going to require a bit of a train journey to read it, probably. But if you are involved in putting together frameworks, you would strongly advise to have a read of that. That's effectively best practice in putting together frameworks. But all I'm interested in is the NEC Framework Contract, because that's what we're here for today. And the beauty of two things, one, doing things on a webinar, and two, the fact that MacDonald pays for the licenses, I can show you what the framework contract looks like. There we go. Look, it's a framework contract. And amazingly, it's only got 2 pages of text. 2 pages for the framework contract. Now, I'll be honest, once the lawyers get hold of it, it might have a few more words and a bit more detail on it, but the crux of it, the process for making a framework work, is relatively simple. Throughout this presentation, I'm sorry, I do resort to CMAs. Anybody that knows me or has heard me present before will know what a CMA is. It's a completely meaningless acronym or a completely meaningless abbreviation, either way. So these are some of these for the various NEC contracts. As we said, the framework contract allows contracts to be awarded either as, I'm sorry, we haven't, have we? This is new. The framework contract, the NEC Framework Contract, gives you the option to award 2 different types of contracts. One is called a time charge order, and this is what it says. It's a contract to provide advice. And it's to provide advice on a proposed work order. Hang on, the work order, that's coming. But first, let's just provide advice. And it says in the contract it's on a time charge basis. But to be honest, that's all it says. There's nothing in principle to stop that time charge order being a lump sum professional services contract or a priced professional services short contract. What it does say, the contract does in the contract itself, it suggests that the contract that you're going to use for your time charge order will be the NEC's professional services short contract. Now, one of those webinars, I think the last webinar I gave for APM was a whole hour specifically on that short contract. But once we've had that advice and we've talked with the contractor, then we can move on to a work order. As I said that, that's a mistake, because we don't actually have to have a time charge order before a work order. We can, if we want to, go straight to a work order. It's super flexible. That work order to carry out any work within the italics framework scope. Again, anybody that knows me and knows my training will know that the word italics means it's in the contract data. And that's the same in any NEC contract. So somewhere in a document called the contract data, when you're putting the contract together, you're required to write what is the framework scope. And that work order can be under the engineering and construction contract of any main option, or it could be under the engineering construction short contract. If nothing else on this session, you're going to learn that the framework is an immensely flexible beast. A warning for you. This framework contract, there's absolutely no limit on the value of the work orders that can be instructed under it. And each time charge order, each work order is a separate contract. Now, in some client organizations, that causes problems, mainly just because of protocol and governance. Every time we have a separate contract, it's got to be signed and sealed by head office. That's a problem. And to be honest, that's one reason why some people shy away from this NEC framework contract, and they find different ways to fudge doing work when we don't quite know what we want and in bits and pieces. But all I'm saying here is if you have got the framework contract, you need to recognise that and make sure you've got appropriate governance processes in place to keep track of which of these work orders, particularly the construction chunky work orders, how they are able to be let. But I hope you could sort out your governance to make that maybe a little bit less onerous than might be for a case for a completely standalone new contract. I'm hoping that makes sense. One thing I haven't said, I don't think Ellie emphasised enough, we want this session to be as interactive as possible. Please do use the chat functionality to ask questions. And if there's any decent ones, Ellie will interrupt me during my prattle here today. So please do feel free to throw in questions at any point. So, pictures. I like pictures. At a framework level, we've already said we've got a framework contract between client and supplier one. We've got the same framework contract between client and supplier two. But then we let a contract. So if it's a professional services or professional services short contract, that's a contract between client and consultant. If we let a construction contract, that's going to be a work order to a contractor. But what you need to understand is that supplier, that consultant, that contractor, they're actually the same entity, but they've got a different name because they're doing a different thing under a different contract. I like to think of the framework contract also as a bit of a coat hanger, because included within the framework contract, you can include your standard stuff, your standard specifications, your standard details, or whatever. You can put that at the framework level, so you can then point to it from each individual contract, and you don't have to repeat it again. Let's save some paper. Anybody out there remember paper?
Hi, Richard. A couple of questions have come in.
Please, great.
So, what would be the main difference between a framework contract and a service term contract?
Okay, brilliant question. So, as I've explained already, the framework contract, each and every new chunk of work is a separate contract, and we need to put it together and do it and negotiate it, sort it out as a separate contract. Under a term services contract, you can have a term services contract for a long period of time, and the NEC has a contract called the term services contract. Guess what? That's the next one I'm going to do in this series. And essentially, the term services contract is to provide an ongoing service. So it could be the facilities management of a building, although I shouldn't have said that because NEC's also got a new contract for facilities management. But anyway, in principle, a term services contract is for an ongoing service. The confusion, this is probably where the question comes from, is that term service contract also allows the client to instruct individual tasks within the single term service contract. So if you've got a series of things that you do doing, there's a slide coming later actually emphasizing that you could do that as separate tasks within a term service contract. The choice is maybe it's better to do it as completely separate contracts under the framework contract. That's the main difference. Over.
Thank you. And how does the NEC framework compare to the FAC1?
I knew somebody was going to ask me that, because FAC1 is Mr. Moses' framework contract. It is a different framework contract. And as I say to graduates going to their professional review, if you don't know the answer, say so. I'm totally honest with you, I have never even managed to open or see the FAC1 contract, so I honestly don't know. My expertise is very much in NEC contracts, which is why I'm here today. I think it would be good to get David Mosey to do a presentation on the difference between the two. Over.
Great, thank you, Richard. Carry on.
All right. Okay, so as a pretty picture, can we get rid of that? Yeah, we can. As a pretty picture, there is a period. We have an end date. It's in italics. What does that mean? It's in the contract data. So that's typically your 5 or your whatever year period. And over that time period, as we said, we can issue time charge orders or work orders. Those could be the time charge order. The default is for that to be under the professional services short contract. Then later we might have an ECC contract. That's the big construction contract, option A, lump sum. We can have another one, reimbursable. We can have a short contract. It's super mega flexible. You can do what you like under a framework as long as you've thought about it and set it up to do what you want it to do. Super flexible. Which contract are you going to use for the work orders? I don't know. It's up to you. There's the big contract in NEC, there's a construction contract, there's a short contract. Now, I could start prattling about the differences between the two, but that's not really the purposes of today's presentation. The short contract, guess what, is simpler, and it doesn't have it doesn't have the very professional program management requirements of the ECC. What you've got to be clear is what is the framework scope. So, as I said, indicatively, quite often we see the scope might be construction contracts with a value of between 100,000 and $1 million or something. It doesn't matter, but you've got to define it within your framework scope. Obviously, right from the very start, as a client, well, what are we trying to do? It doesn't matter. Whatever it is you're trying to do, write that down in the scope, and then you give yourself the power to issue contracts to enact that sort of work. Could that change? Possibly, in which case most clients will make sure that the definition of the framework scope is wonderfully broad to enable them to actually do almost anything underneath it. We'll see later that one of the documents that we asked the supplier to submit is what's called quotation information. So you can ask for prices of or any other sort of financial information within that quotation information. And obviously knowing what you're going to use this framework for is going to guide you into what sort of information you want to get from your bidder. So again, super flexible. Okay, so I've told you that the purpose of the framework is to let contracts. How do we do it? I always like pictures. So this is the tramline picture. Client's representative for each piece of work has to choose between the suppliers. Remember, there might be five suppliers under the framework. Again, just a detail, we use this language under the framework. They will each actually have separate framework contracts, but they will be identical framework or nearly identical contracts. It's in italics. You've got to write it. It's a bespoke document called the selection procedure. So you've got to write from a blank sheet of paper, you've got to write down how you're going to go through the process of selecting which of the suppliers are going to be invited to do the next bit of work. Once you've done that, you can then issue a time charge order to the chosen supplier. And all it says is after consultation. There's no quote, as we'll see in a minute, there's no quotation process for those time charge orders. So the intent is that the client has got on their framework team a range of suppliers, and maybe for this little bit of professional services work, maybe they'll just pick them. They'll just say, tell you what, Mott, MacDonald, you've got people to do that. You can do that for me. I should say other consultants are available. They could ask Arup to do another bit of work also. Now, some of you have come across the concept of early contractor involvement, which is where a two-stage process where we get the contractor to come in early and help us define what we want to do. Now, there's various ways of doing that two-stage contract, but this is one way. You could have a time charge order to do the work required in stage one to get you a point when you're ready to issue the work order to actually build the thing. Hope that makes sense. And if you're doing design in that first stage, even under the time charge order, we could set the document up such that that design is then promised by the contractor and included in the construction contract as NEC language scope provided by the contractor for its design. Those of you who know the ECC will know what I'm talking about. In essence, it becomes part of the scope, but if that contractor's scope has to change to meet the client's scope, that is not a compensation, and therefore the contractor has that risk. So after we've done the time charge work, and again, it's super flexible, we don't have to have a time charge order before a work order. We can just go straight to the suppliers with additional contract data, scope, site information, specific to the work order, and we can instruct the supplier to give us a quotation. Quotation then comes back and gives you a quotation. Guess what? They do it in accordance with the quotation procedure. Again, NEC is super flexible. NEC does not tell you what the quotation procedure is. You're going to have to write it. Words to describe how the quotation is to be put together and submitted to you, the client. And the assessment of the price for that quotation uses a document I mentioned a moment ago, the quotation information, which is in italics. It's in the contract. That's whatever pre-pricing information you might have required the contractor to give you, the supplier to give you, which will be then therefore be required to be the basis of the price for any subsequent work order. You then...
Just one quick question.
Please.
Sorry. So we must start from from the start, we must state all the different NEC contracts that we're going to use. For example, after the contract has been awarded, you may want to now have the supplier do a design, but you did not specify up front that you'll be using the professional services contract. Is it then not allowed to add into the NEC contract?
Okay, really, really good question. Thank you. Under the framework contract, you can only let contracts using the types of contract that you have included within your framework contract. So in your particular example, if you didn't have I think the default is to have the professional services short contract available for these time charge orders. So you could get the client, the consultant to do the work, the supplier, you could get the supplier to do that design work under the professional services short contract. You could also get there's nothing to stop you, some of you on the call will know NEC, under the construction contract. If you've got the ECC in your framework as an option, you could just put out an ECC contract effectively for the design. But if you haven't included for example, if you haven't included the professional services contract in your framework contract, then you won't be allowed to use the PSC. That said, sort of obviously, if both sides now realise there's a need to, or it would be beneficial to both sides to use the professional services contract, it would be a one-line addendum to make that available. But the strict answer to the question is no, you can only use the contracts that you've thought about when you put the framework together. Over.
Thank you. Carry on.
Okay, so we assess that quotation, again, in accordance with the quotation procedure. So that quotation procedure is effectively going to have to include the process, because it says procedure. It's not difficult, is it? It's good, this NEC. It's going to include the procedure for how we're going to assess. So if you're going to assess these quotations based on quality and price, you've got to say that in the quotation procedure. And that quotation procedure, remember, is a standard document to be applied to all of the contracts that are going to be let under your contract. So it needs very careful drafting to get that right. And then, as you'd expect, the client's representative has three options. They can say, yes, great, get on with it. Or they can say, please revise it. Or they can say, forget it, we're not going to do this thing after all. So again, there's lots of subtlety in that slide, but hopefully a useful picture of what you're going to do. For a time charge order, as I've said, it's a contract to provide advice on a time charge basis. If a supplier is selected for a time charge order, all it says is that the client's representative issues the time charge order to the supplier. And all it says, it uses this one word, which I put in red, the client's rep consults with the supplier about the content. So we consult, whatever that means. That means we have a chat to make sure when the supplier gets this time charge order, they don't have a fit. That's all it says about the process of agreeing the time charge order. Full stop. A little bit of drama in the PowerPoint. There's no mention of a quotation process for the time charge order. However, if you know you are or might want to have some sort of quotation process, if you wanted to build that into your framework, you could include that within this selection procedure. The contract data suggests that the standard contract for a time charge order will be the professional service short contract. Okay. What does a framework contract actually look like? Well, I showed you what it looks like. This is not really what I mean. I mean, how's it going to work? So the structure of the framework contract, we've got the document, which is those 2 pages of clauses that I showed you. And like all NEC contracts, it has a, sorry, that's a line, like the NEC big contracts, it has a contract data part 1 and a part 2. The part 2 is put together by the client. Sorry, part 1 is put together by the client. Part 2 is put together by the supplier. Then, as you've already learned, we've also got some stuff relevant to a specific time charge order or a specific work order. So the way it works is that in our contract data for the framework contract, we fill in all the standard stuff that's going to apply to all TCOs, TCO, another CMA, time charge order. So all the standard stuff we say once, and we say it up front, and we should put that in the tender document for the framework. Likewise, some of the standard entries in the consultant's offer, that's the language used under a professional services short contract, and the price list, if there are standard things that are going to apply to all the TCOs, then we'll do them once. And we'll do it at the start in the framework contract itself. But when we work out what we actually want for a specific time charge order, we've then got another document which fills in the other bits of the contract data, the work specific or the design, whatever it is, the specific stuff for that particular time charge order. And then the contractor, as we'll see in a minute, will come back to us with the specific stuff that relates to the time to the time charge order, the stuff that would normally be the contractor's bid in the separate non-framework world. Likewise, for the construction contract, we put in our framework contract all the standard stuff that's going to apply to all work orders. Likewise, from the contractor does likewise in part 2. You can see the logic, it's all very similar. The contractor comes back, we put together the specific stuff, the contractor comes back with the specific stuff, we go through the process and we say, lovely chubbly, please do some stuff under the work order. Again, lots of pictures. I like the pictures. I hope you like the pictures and that makes some sense. If not, shout the questions. Okay, sorry. If we've also chosen to use a short contract, engineering construction short contract, same principle applies. We'll have the standard stuff in the client's contract data. See the subtle difference in the short contract is called the client's contract data. Likewise, the contractors, you can see the picture. I'm just repeating myself too many times. It's the same principle applies. We've got standard stuff and we've got contract specific stuff for either professional services short contract or construction contract or NEC short construction contract. Hope the picture makes sense. How much detail are we going to put in the standard stuff? Well, normally you'll start with the ECC contract data form and you'll complete all the entries that are genuinely standard. For the other entries, you just write in to be advised in the additional contract data for the work order. Now, you might need flexibility to add and delete specific compensation events. And that's actually very easy now in NEC 4 because some of you will know NEC 4 has a new entry for additional compensation events. So if the team decides that we need an additional compensation event for this particular work order, you can just write that in as an additional compensation event in that little box in the contract data. The only thing you've got to be wary about is that if you have put quotation information in your, if you've asked for tendered prices in the quotation information, you've got to be a little bit careful about playing with the risk allocation in the subsequent contracts. What you can't do is start adding in Z clauses and changing the mechanics of the call-off contracts. Sorry, that might be the first time I've used the word call-off. In our industry, colloquially, people use this term call-off contracts under a framework. When it comes to the site, scope and the site information, particularly the scope, might well be standard documents, the standard specifications, standard details. Further detail to be advised in the contract data specific to the work order.
One question, Richard.
Please, yeah.
Can you change the information that applies to all TCOs/WOs at framework level once you get to contract level?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. I don't think so. I think that's fixed because there's no sort of compensation event or direct change mechanism within the framework contract itself. So I think my answer is going to be no. So if you decided, say you've got document A as a standard scope, and you subsequently realise you should have had it as document A plus B, all you would need to do is just make sure you include B every time in the subsequent contracts. I think that's the right answer. Stop. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Move on. So I've done that one, I think. Yeah, we did. So we've also got another document in the framework called the Framework Information. And that says the framework information includes, it's very, very simple language as usual in NEC, how the parties work together and they attend meetings as stated in the framework information. So that's where you put your high level stuff about how the whole framework's going to work. That's where you'll have words like each supplier shall have a framework manager, that sort of stuff. That's just for the framework level stuff, not for the contract level stuff. What it might include, though, is the high level objectives, details of the framework, including its structure, number of suppliers appointed, how we're going to work together, frequency of meetings, all this sort of thing. If you go back to David Moyes' bigger document on good practice on framework agreements, I'm sure you'll get some more detail on what the world thinks is a good idea to have in that framework information. Again, it's the stuff that you're wanting to be done as a standard at the framework level. There's no money in the framework. You don't get paid under the framework. Remember, the framework is just it is a contract, but it is a framework, it's a contract to agree contracts. This is a real problem, actually. I've seen this problem in MacDonald. So for example, we had a framework contract with a big water company. There's actually quite a lot of work involved at the framework level for that framework manager and so on and so forth. And if the client doesn't pay that person, the cost of that person is going to have to be spread around and included somewhere in the rates, somewhere in the fee percentages. So it might be better to actually pay directly for that framework work. But the only way to do that, or a simple way to do that, is to set up an initial time charge order to pay the contractor for the framework level work. Hopefully that makes sense. The framework contract data also includes that framework scope that we've talked about. And in that box for framework scope, you're going to say the type of work that's going to be done under the framework. Again, if you've been asking for prices particularly, you better be clear about where it's going to be done. And clearly, you should be making that sufficiently detailed to make sure that everybody knows what we're doing where. And therefore, when you do your whatever checks or whatever qualification you're doing at the framework level, you're making sure that your supplier has actually got resources required. We've also got an end date, and that under the contract is just the last date to issue either of these two things, the time charge orders or the work orders. What the framework contract does not have is a mechanism to extend it. And that's one thing where your client might want a mechanism to extend it without having to go out again. Again, this is fairly standard. So most of the frameworks I see, so many of the frameworks we see are, for example, 4 years with a possibility of another 1+1. You see language like 4+1+1. That mechanism is not in the NEC Framework Contract. If you had to draft a Z clause to do that, a starting point for that might be the language in option X23 of the term service contract, because that's for extending the service period. That's not legal advice, as they say, but that's a possible starting point. The framework contract data part 1, as I've already said, includes this bespoke selection procedure to work out who's going to be selected to get the chance to tender. And as I said already, there's no quotation procedure for time charge orders. So if you do want to select your consultants for at the time charge order stage, if you do want to include prices in that, you're going to have to build that into your bespoke selection procedure. That's what it says there. When it comes to setting the mechanism up, you might want to include standard rates in the consultant's offer as part of that selecting the supplier for a time charge order. NEC, if you're not aware, has a general guidance note called Selecting a Supplier, fairly high level, but it's very good practice. I think it's sort of best practice for the process of doing selection of suppliers. A good read in your spare time. It also includes a quotation procedure, which, as I've probably already hinted at, is this bespoke process for how you're going to quote for the work orders. How quotations are going to be submitted, what format you want them to be included in perhaps, and again, how the quotations are going to be assessed. As I said before, that's going to have to include whether you're going to do price or quality in your assessment. You might give the client options for inviting bids from more than one supplier and or direct award to a single supplier. Like all this thing, my friends, you've heard the adage, say what you're going to do what you said. So you've got to think in advance how you want this framework to work, write it down, and having written it down, you've got to do what it said. And there's been a couple of questions already. Once you've set out how it's going to work, you have defined the process, you've then got to stick with it. Quality, price, we've mentioned. So that's the picture I gave you for the framework contract. That's what your job's going to look like. Logically, the forms for those contract-specific bits are going to be written in your quotation procedure. So you've got a nice standard form ready for each of these documents in each of these blobs on the right-hand side, ready to be filled in to allow the documents required to put from both the client and the supplier, the documents required to form the time charge order or the work order. Other key documents, this is now part 2. So remember, part 2 is the bit that comes back from the supplier at the tender stage, and the tender stage for the framework. So that quotation information is the basis of how we're going to assess quotations for work orders. Now, if we know what type of work we're going to be asking for, and if we know we're going to be asking for lump sum option A contracts, if it's appropriate, the client might ask for, we obviously see this very often, don't we? We see a schedule of rates. We ask the contractor, the supplier, to give us a schedule of rates for a cube of concrete or whatever. Very, very difficult for the bidders to price. I wouldn't recommend that, to be honest. But if any financial information you do want for the bidder, this is the place to put it. I just mentioned there from a case in Northern Ireland way back in 2008 now, where there was a challenge. A framework contract had been awarded purely on a fee percentage, and the courts decided that wasn't enough information. We did have to have some more financial information to be allowed to properly award the contract. Quotation information, again, is likely to point to commercial information in the standard contract data part 2. So if you want a standard fee percentage to be applied in all of your quotes for all of your work orders, this is the place you're going to have to put it so that you get that number at the point of the quotation information, in the quotation information submitted to you at the bid stage for the framework, and therefore that's fixed, written in ink, in stone, ready to be used for each of the subsequent contracts. Another picture, I do like pictures. My picture of the framework contract. Having said all that, we've got a part 1. The part 1 points to the conditions of contract. That's just the 2 pages conditions of contract of the NEC Framework Contract. But it also points to whatever stuff we want in the PSSC, client's contract data. Remember, the stuff that applies to all of the time charge orders. Likewise, we have all of the stuff that's going to be applied to the work orders. We have a framework information, which we talked about, a framework scope, a selection procedure, a quotation procedure. And like all other contracts in NEC, the whole contract works because the contract data points to all of the other documents. The bidder at the framework stage, the supplier, okay, I need to change my slide. My slide is wrong. I hate it when I see a slide that's wrong at this stage in a presentation. I should say, anybody want to tell me what's wrong? Can't do that because you can't talk to me. That should say from supplier and not from bidder. I will change that for you before I send the slides out today. Sorry about that. Like I said, this is the first time this presentation has been given online. So in part 2, again, we get all the standard contract data entries from the contractor. We get all the standard contract data part 2 entries that are going to be applicable to all work orders. I think I might have lied to you a moment ago when I talked about the fee percentage. That's the place where the contractor's fee percentage to be applied to all work orders will be included. Quotation information, whatever else we've asked for. And again, the part 2 document points to all those documents so that when we sign up this contract, the letter of acceptance, or if you need a form of agreement, they will just point to the contract data because the contract data points to everything else. Unfortunately, the lawyers never believe me on that one. They always love to write it out again in the form of agreement. I don't know why. It really annoys me. Move on. Do we need any additional conditions of contract? In other words, Z clauses. I think the only one we've mentioned, or I've mentioned, was possibly you might want one to allow you to extend the end date. If you are going to put in additional conditions, please, please, please be very clear why you think it's needed, what you're going to do, how it's going to work. And again, as I mentioned, there are a couple of things I thought about when I put the slides together. Obviously, there's no mention in the standard contract as to whether or not the contracts under the framework are going to be, as we say, underhand or as a deed. That's just language that the lawyers use for a deed has a longer liability period, 12 years in the UK. Contract underhand is just 6 years. It doesn't say anything about that. So if you need to say something about that, you're going to need to put that somewhere in your framework agreement. As I mentioned, we might want a mechanism to end the end date. And a really important point here, particularly in the current scenario, the current world, if you are asking for any rates at a framework level, you are probably going to need a mechanism to provide a provision for inflation of those rates. And then please, please, please remember to include option X1, which is the provision for inflation, in the call-off contracts. In Mott MacDonald, we've had several contracts where we signed up to a contract where at a framework level, there's a mechanism to change the rates, but at a contract level, there was no mechanism directly to provide for inflation. So yes, we get our rates increased, but we don't get the price for the contract increase. That's actually one for some of you to be wary of in your existing framework contracts. Form of agreement, do we need one? There's guidance note in the prepare and manage. I should have said, I haven't said already, NEC in its normal sweet way publishes the framework contract. It also publishes a document called Preparing and Managing a Framework Contract, which, as you'd like to think, I had a bit of a skim through at least before I put through this presentation. Okay, flowcharts and guidance, 19 pages. We haven't even mentioned the core clauses of this contract. Can't believe I've given a whole presentation without talking about the clauses. That's not true. I have given clause references to some of these processes. There are fairly standalone, fairly obvious quote clauses about things like corrupt acts and termination, but I'm not going to get into the detail of that on a 1-hour presentation. When it comes to tender evaluation of that framework, it's going to be interesting. I'm not going to say much more. It's going to depend what you've asked for and depend on what you think you might actually be letting during this framework. It's going to be quite an interesting document to put together. Okay, what it will include for are the things where if you have asked for any financial assessment, you're going to have to find a way of building those numbers into your tender evaluation. Quite an interesting little challenge you're going to have, particularly if you've got a whole load of flexibility in the types of contract you're going to let under the framework. So in summary, it's very simple in principle. It's just 2 pages. You could all sit down and read it in 5 minutes. But I think you'll agree the devil is in the detail. Last slide, probably. Favourite slide in any NEC training course by Richard Patterson. Those are the first 2 clauses in the contract. Act as stated in the contract. I've told you I don't like CMAs. I lie. That very first clause tells you to do what it says in the chuffing contract. To do that, you're going to have to read the chuffing contract. That's easy. The second clause is more difficult. I've just gone through this on a training course before this today. I've done it already once today. If you've got a partner in your life, how on earth do you maintain a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation? Simple answer is you bloody well talk and listen to them. You talk and listen to each other. And that is my favourite slide of any NEC training. And I had to drop it in here under the framework. Why not? To make this framework work, that's what we're going to have to do. Subtle change that's in 2 clauses in NEC 4. You didn't really need to know that. One of the questions earlier were, do we have to use a framework? Are there any other ways? As I mentioned earlier, you can use the task order mechanism in the NEC term service contract, which allows you to have separate chunks of work. Each of those separate chunks can have a separate required completion date, can even have delay damages. And that's why we see an awful lot of clients doing exactly that. My warning to you is that the term services contract is designed for a service. It's not really designed for a construction contract. So, for example, if it hasn't got any compensation events for physical conditions or weather, for example. So if you do that, do it carefully and have a think about it. The other thing you can do, and we see being done by many clients, and we've helped many clients to do this, is I'm talking about here procuring chunks. I use this technical term chunk of work, a piece of work. You can use Z clauses, additional conditions of contract, to tweak the ECC or the PSC to allow you to issue chunks of work section by section. I did that with Yorkshire Water and my good friend Rob Gerrard and others who might be on the call many, many years ago for Yorkshire Water for a contract for 600 reservoirs. We had 1,800 compensation events and then compensation events on the compensation events, because each chunk of work was issued as a new section as a compensation event. It's possible, but it's a bit messy. And just to show you that we have written about those two things, there's two articles there. One of them is in the NEC newsletter. There's a link to it, how to procure packages of work. So one of the options there is the framework contract. The alternatives, term service contract or bastardized ECC. If you're interested in the bastardized ECC paper, you could go back to this article, this paper. God, don't I look young there? That was written way back when. When was that? I can't remember. 2001. Bloody hell. 2001. That's how we did it. And I went into print showing how we did it. We've probably tweaked it a little bit since then, but you get the idea of the process. I'm roughly on time, I think. Let's have a look at the clock. I'm 6 minutes early. I'm never early on a presentation. Ellie, have you got any more questions for me?
We have got questions, yes. So one question is, how does the time charge order look like?
How does a time charge order look like? Well, okay, NEC e-copies, NEC 4 contracts, professional services short contract. This is a really trite answer, I'm very sorry. But it looks like one of them. It's a professional services contract. It's a contract. All the difference is with a framework, all it's doing is giving you a process to put that call-off contract into place. What does it look like? Well, sorry, that's another presentation. Go back and have a look at the presentation I gave last time for PS on NEC. I gave a whole hour presentation on the professional services short contract. But like any other contract, it will have conditions, it will have scope, it will have a pricing document, and so on. Over.
Thank you. And someone has asked, could you give a bit more detail regarding time charge to fixed fee on framework contracts?
Time charge to fixed fee. Okay, that's quite an interesting question. Where did I say this? I think right at the very start. Let me have a look through my slides. First one.
I'm also just going to pop up the screen
of
takeaways.
Sorry, just hang on a second. The definition of a time charge order is a contract to provide advice, but what that contract looks like, it's up to you because you're putting this framework together. So the default, the suggested format for that professional services contract for the for this advice is a professional services short contract. But those of you that were with me last time might remember, I'm probably pushing my luck there, might remember that under a professional services short contract, you can pay the consultant by a combination of rates or lump sums or based on time and expenses. So it's super flexible again. So again, you've got to think about how you want to do it, write it down, and then so that your framework sets up how you want to issue those time charge orders. So if you wanted the time charge order to be on a lump sum professional services contract, you could do. If you wanted to be under a PSSC short contract with a price list, which is effectively the same as a PSC option A, you could do. Is that good enough? I hope so. I think so. Please, if any of these answers are not good enough, please come back very quickly and keep Ellie busy for me. All right.
Thank you. Over. So Josie has asked that it has been suggested to her to use the NEC framework for a single supplier D and B with a target cost program and use call-offs for each project within the program. What are your thoughts of using it this way?
Absolutely brilliant. Why not? If your client has decided that they've got a series of projects and they've decided that the best format, the best contract for those projects is going to be NEC option C, And if you want this concept of framework, the whole policy, and therefore that you've got this cuddly gang of suppliers that you can go to without having to go out to tender, then yes, use a framework contract in exactly the way I've described today. Absolutely, why not? Over.
Thank you. Please keep your questions coming in as well. So we have one that asks, what is the proper procedure for reviewing quotes under the PSC NEC contract?
Under the PSC contract. So when we said quotes, I'm assuming in the context of this presentation, you mean the quotation for doing the job, in other words, the job itself. And the answer will be on the slide somewhere. The answer will be, well, the contractor provides their quotation in accordance with, in this one. Okay, so going back to I did say this on the slide before, on the presentation before. The framework agreement, as I said at least twice, does not have a quotation procedure for the time charge order. If you want to build in a quotation procedure for that, the place to do that would be within the document that is there, which is called a selection procedure. From my experience of working with contracts generally over quite a few years now, if you want to add or change something in a contract, you're always better building it in within something that's already there. So the framework contract's already got this thing called a selection procedure. If you want to do that based on the pricing from the suppliers, then write that into the selection procedure. Over.
Great, thank you. So I think that closes out the questions, unless anybody has any last ones that they want to submit. Just wait one moment.
Can't believe I finished on time, Ellie. This is so unlike me.
And we've also got some lovely key takeaways coming in as well from people, which is really nice to see.
That's good to see. So yeah, please do fill in that. As I do in my normal NEC training feedback, I just like you to give me a one-liner. This was good because, this was better if. If you've got some ideas how I can make this presentation better, don't be shy, please tell me. Like I said, I think I've given this presentation to one client. I've certainly never given it, that was online, but I've certainly never given this to Joe Public. So I think this is, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but this may well be the first ever public presentation on the NEC Framework Contract. And I hope it was of some use to you, obviously.
I'm sure it was. So we'll just close out there then. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And again, thank you, Richard, for giving up your time to host this event. Richard has run a series of NEC contract webinars with us, and his next session will take place on the 18th of October. So I hope you can join us then. You just go to the APM website and you can book on to that event there. We'd be grateful if you could complete...
Sorry, I was going to say, I'm sure we will be sharing these slides out as part of the wrap-up. And I've just literally 5 minutes before I gave the presentation, I've just cut and stuck the links to each of those previous sessions on here on these slides. So you'll have them in one place to find them if they're of any use to you. Okay?
Absolutely, and we'd be grateful if you could complete your post-event survey and also check our upcoming events and webinars via the APM website. Those slides will be uploaded to our SlideShare and obviously the APM YouTube channel as well for the presentation. So I hope you all keep well, everybody. Enjoy your weekends, and hopefully we'll see you on the next webinar. Take care.
Okay, thanks very much, Ellie.
Thanks,
Bye
Richard. Bye-bye.